While American soldiers returned to fire support bases with cots and canvas tents, their Australian counterparts were choosing to sleep in swamps, not by accident, by design. This is the untold story of how the SAS discovered that extreme suffering could become an invisible shield in Vietnam, and how this discovery would reshape special operations warfare for generations to come. It was 1966 when the Australian Special Air Service arrived in Phuoc Tuy Province. They weren't brought in to fight bigger battles. They were brought in to think differently. The Americans had built a doctrine around comfort disguised as strategy. Establish a base, fortify it, return to it every night, sleep under a roof, wake up refreshed, fight the next day. It made sense on paper. In the jungle, it made you a fixed target. To understand the significance of the SAS arrival, you have to understand the state of the war at that moment. The United States had been escalating its involvement in Vietnam since 1964. By 1966, there were over 200,000 American troops deployed in the country. The strategy was straightforward: deploy overwhelming force, establish secure areas, conduct patrols and operations from these secure areas, gradually expand the secure area until they covered the entire country. It was the doctrine that had worked in World War II and Korea. It was the doctrine that the American military understood at its deepest institutional level. The fire support bases were engineering marvels for their time. They were constructed with military precision across Phuoc Tuy Province and throughout the country. Perimeter walls made from sandbags and concertina wire, stacked 10 or 12 feet high. Mortar pits positioned at calculated angles to provide supporting fire for any direction of attack. Supply depots organized with quartermaster efficiency, with ammunition and food and medical supplies stockpiled for weeks of sustained operations. Sleeping quarters with elevated platforms to keep soldiers out of the mud and the insects. Mess tents where hot meals were served at regular intervals, with cooks preparing food for hundreds of men. Medical stations with doctors and corpsmen, ammunition storage bunkers, command centers with radios and maps. These bases were islands of American order carved out of the jungle chaos. But they were also monuments to a fundamental misunderstanding of how warfare functioned in an environment like Vietnam. The bases were visible. The smoke from cooking fires could be detected kilometers away on a still morning. A trained observer could smell the smoke and know exactly what was being cooked and estimate how many soldiers in the camp. The radio transmissions could be triangulated by enemy signals intelligence specialists who had been trained by the Soviet Union and by China. The movement patterns of supply helicopters could be predicted with accuracy. The bases were so predictable that Viet Cong mortar teams didn't even need sophisticated targeting equipment. They could calculate fire patterns based on routine alone. Every morning at dawn, at roughly 5:30 or 6 o'clock, Viet Cong mortars would rain down on these bases. The barrage would last for 5 or 10 minutes, sometimes longer. The initial salvo would come without warning, rounds falling suddenly from the sky. The first round would explode in the middle of the camp, and then they would come rapidly, 3 or 4 per minute, sometimes more. Soldiers would scatter to trenches and fortified positions. Some wouldn't get up. Others would be bleeding or burned or permanently damaged. Some would be dead before their comrades could get to them. The Americans called it warfare. The SAS called it predictability. They understood something fundamental about the war that nobody else did. The battlefield wasn't the jungle. The battlefield was psychology. And the enemy's psychology depended entirely on assumptions about what men would and wouldn't do. The Australian military had been fighting in Southeast Asia since the early 1960s. They had sent military advisors to Malaya to observe the British counterinsurgency campaign. They had learned from the British experience. The British had been fighting communist insurgents in Malaya for years, and they had developed tactics that emphasized mobility and the ability to operate in the jungle with minimal support. The Australians had inherited these lessons. The SAS had additional experience beyond what was available to most military. The SAS had been conducting special operations since World War II. They had operated behind enemy lines in North Africa. They had fought in Southeast Asia during World War II, conducting raids and intelligence gathering in Burma and Malaya. After the war, they had been involved in the counterinsurgency campaign in Malaya, where they had learned to operate in the jungle with minimal supplies and maximum effectiveness. The Malaya experience was crucial. In Malaya, the British had initially tried to win the counterinsurgency campaign through conventional means, but it wasn't working. The insurgents, called the Malayan National Liberation Army, were elusive. They operated from jungle bases that the British couldn't find or assault effectively. Then the British changed tactics. They began to focus on intelligence gathering and establishing a presence in the jungle itself. They created small patrol bases. They learned to move through the jungle silently. They learned to observe enemy movements rather than always engaging them. The SAS was at the forefront of these tactical innovations. By the time the SAS arrived in Vietnam in 1966, they had 2 decades of experience operating in jungle environments. They understood things about the jungle that the Americans were still learning. They understood that visibility was a liability. They understood that movement could be faster and more effective than firepower. They understood that gathering intelligence was sometimes more valuable than killing enemies. Major Peter Badko was one of the first to implement what would become the SAS doctrine in Vietnam. He was a decorated officer with experience in Malaya and Borneo. He had served in the Korean War. He was a veteran of multiple combat zones. He understood that comfort created patterns. Patterns created vulnerabilities, but discomfort created invisibility. The question wasn't how to survive in the jungle. The question was how to disappear into it so completely that the enemy wouldn't even think to look. Badko began experimenting with patrols that operated outside the established base framework. Instead of returning to a fire support base each night, these patrols would establish temporary positions in the jungle itself. The positions were chosen deliberately for their inhospitability. They weren't in clearings where soldiers could see clearly. They weren't in areas with obvious water access, because those areas were patrolled regularly by Viet Cong forces looking for signs of enemy presence. They weren't in areas with high ground for observation, because high ground made you visible. They were in the worst possible terrain, swamps where the water was black and still and thick with decaying vegetation, mud so deep that a soldier could sink up to his waist, thorns and spines on every plant, designed by nature to discourage anything from passing through, vegetation so dense that daylight became rumor, the kind of terrain that looked on a map like empty space but was actually nearly impenetrable. These positions were called harbor positions. The name came from naval terminology. A harbor was a place where ships anchored safely, protected from external threats. A harbor position was a place where men could anchor themselves, invisible to external threats, but the protection came at a cost that no conventional military doctrine would have considered acceptable. The first harbor positions were established in 1966, in late summer and early fall. Badko took a small team into the jungle south of Nui Dat. The team consisted of experienced soldiers who had volunteered for this experimental tactic. They were moving deliberately into an area where they would be surrounded by the enemy, but where the enemy would never think to look for them. When darkness fell completely, the team established their position. No fires, no talking above a whisper, no cigarettes. The insects would come first. Mosquitoes that sounded like angry radios, their high-pitched whine a constant reminder of the danger of detection. The mosquitoes in Vietnam were different from mosquitoes in other parts of the world. They were aggressive. They bit hard. They carried diseases, malaria and dengue fever, and various types of encephalitis. Then the leeches, dozens of them, hundreds sometimes. They were attracted to the heat of human bodies, sensing the vibrations of blood and movement through the water and mud. The leeches in Southeast Asia were particularly vicious. They were larger than leeches in other parts of the world. They were more aggressive. They fed more efficiently. The leeches would attach to exposed skin in feeding. The pain wasn't sharp, persistent. A dull, creeping sensation would continue all night. The longer they fed, the more they would swell. A leech that started the size of a fingernail would become the size of a thumb. A soldier could have dozens of them attached to his legs, his arms, his neck, his chest, his genitals. The soldiers could feel them pulsing through blood, could feel the weight of them as they multiplied across their bodies. The standard protocol was simple. Let them feed. Don't pull them off. Don't burn them. Don't scratch them. Each of these actions would create a scent signal. Fire creates light, smoke detection. Blood from a pulled leech is a signal in the water, a chemical signature that could be detected by those trained to notice. The Viet Cong were trained to notice such things. They moved through the jungle by scent as much as by sight. So the operators lay in the mud, leeches attached to their legs, their arms, their necks, their genitals, and they stayed absolutely still. They practiced a discipline that went beyond military training. They practiced the discipline of voluntary suffering. It was a discipline that had to be learned because it violated every instinct in the human body. The first night in a harbor position was the worst. Soldiers would arrive with expectations shaped by conventional military. They would expect to be cold or hungry or uncomfortable in ways they had experienced before. But leeches were different. The sensation of something feeding on your body while you couldn't move or react triggered primal responses: fear, revulsion, panic. The soldiers had to overcome these responses through sheer mental discipline. One SAS soldier, in his first harbor position, described the experience of the first night. He said that he couldn't sleep because of the leeches. He would lie in the mud and feel them attaching to his skin. He would feel them beginning to. His brain would scream at him to pull them off, to move, to do something, but he couldn't. He had to remain still. He had to. He said that by 3 in the morning, he had reached a kind of psychological breaking point. He had endured everything that his mind told him he couldn't endure. And on the other side of that breaking point, something had changed. He had stopped being afraid. He had stopped being disgusted. He had started understanding that the leeches were actually protecting him. By the 3rd or 4th night in a harbor, something changed in the psychology of these soldiers. They stopped seeing the leeches as a threat and started seeing them as allies. The leeches were evidence that they were in a place where no rational enemy would ever search. The leeches were rendering these men invisible. A man covered in leeches in a mud swamp wasn't a threat that an enemy soldier. Therefore, no enemy soldier would be looking for it. By morning, they would remove the leeches carefully. The process had to be done with precision because if you pulled a leech while it was feeding, it would leave its mouthparts embedded in your skin, creating an infection. The infection could become serious in a jungle environment where wounds didn't heal easily. Instead, the proper technique was to apply salt or insect repellent or even soap to make the leech release on its own. The leech would release its grip and fall away. The soldier would move carefully to the next leech and repeat the process. The skin underneath would be marked with small circles of blood, sometimes dozens of them across a single body. The circles would form patterned, geometric arrangements of blood on pale skin. It looked like a disease. It looked like something that no human being should have to endure. But that was the price of remaining invisible. The contrast between the American approach and the SAS approach became stark over time. An American platoon operating from a fire support base would complete their patrol, moving through the jungle during the morning and afternoon. They would encounter occasional enemy forces and engage them. Sometimes they would win these engagements. Sometimes they would lose men. By late afternoon, the patrol would return to base. They would return to a base with 100 or more soldiers. They would eat hot meals prepared in the mess tent. The meals would be as good as military. There would be meat and vegetables and bread, and sometimes they would sleep under canvas, on elevated platforms, protected from the mud and the water. They would wake up ready for the next day. They were well fed and well rested. They were also predictable. Mortars would fall at dawn or dusk. The Americans in the base knew roughly when to expect the attacks, and the enemy knew that they would be there. An SAS patrol operating from a harbor position would never establish a fixed camp. They would move through the jungle at night, moving silently and carefully, their boots barely disturbing the ground beneath them. They would be carrying minimal supplies, maybe a rifle, ammunition, water, salt tablets, maybe a small radio, maybe some emergency medical supplies. They would be moving in the dark, moving by memory and by intuition and by training. They would establish a position in a swamp or thornfield, remain perfectly still for 12 hours or more. During this time, they would see enemy movements that the Americans never encountered. They would observe Viet Cong patrols passing within meters of them, unaware that they were surrounded by armed men. They would see supply caches and rest posts and communication points. They would see the enemy in their natural habitat, operating with the assumption that they were safe. But the point wasn't to engage the enemy. The point was to observe, to gather intelligence, to understand enemy movement patterns and supply routes and defensive positions, to understand how the Viet Cong thought and operated and moved, and then to move to a new position before dawn. They would operate on minimal supplies, no fires, no hot food, and no comfort. They would also never be where the enemy expected them to be. The Americans had resources that dwarfed the SAS. The United States had committed over 500,000 troops to Vietnam by 1968. The SAS had a few hundred soldiers. The Americans had overwhelming firepower, countless helicopters, naval support, Air Force bombers, artillery batteries. The SAS had rifles and training and the willingness to be in places where the enemy wouldn't look. Resources only matter if you're willing to be found. And the Americans, by necessity of scale, had to be found. An army of 500,000 soldiers can't hide. It requires infrastructure, supply chains, communication network. All of these things create signatures that an enemy can detect and target. The SAS, by choice, refused to be found. The leeches weren't just an annoyance, they were a filter. They were a mechanism that separated the men who understood the war from the men who were still fighting the war with old assumptions. When a soldier accepted that blood loss, parasites, and mud were acceptable costs for invisibility, he had crossed a psychological threshold. He was no longer a soldier following orders. He was a predator. The psychological component of this transformation was profound. In conventional warfare, soldiers are taught to maintain morale through comfort. They're given hot meals to maintain strength. They're given rotating shifts to maintain rest. They're given medical care to maintain health. All of these things are predicated on the assumption that soldiers fight better when they feel good. There's truth to this. A hungry, exhausted, sick soldier is less effective than a fed, rested, healthy soldier. But the SAS was discovering something different. Soldiers who had stripped away the expectation of comfort fought differently. They had less to lose. They had no anxiety about defending a base or supplies or a position. Their entire tactical framework was based on movement and invisibility rather than holding territory. This psychological difference translated into tactical superiority. A soldier in a fire support base is fighting to defend the base. He has an emotional investment in the An SAS soldier in a harbor position has no base to defend. If the position is discovered, he moves to a different position. He has no emotional investment because he owns nothing and holds nothing and depends on nothing. One operation in particular exemplified this difference. In late 1966, an American fire support base south of Nui Dat was being constantly harassed by mortar fire. The base was called Fire Support Base Ricks. It was a substantial installation with more than 100 soldiers. It had good defensive positions and reasonable supplies, but it was being hammered. The base commander estimated that enemy sappers were establishing firing positions somewhere in the jungle to the north, maybe 2 or 3 kilometers away. But every patrol sent out to locate them returned without contact. The patrols would move through the jungle, sometimes 5 or 6 kilometers or more. They would find evidence of enemy presence. They would find trails and rest positions, but they wouldn't find the mortar teams. The pattern continued for weeks. Every few days, mortars would fall on fire support base ricks. Sometimes the barrage would be brief, just a few rounds. Sometimes it would last for 10 or 15 minutes. Soldiers would die. The medical station would be overwhelmed. The morale in the base would drop, and then days would pass without any attack. The soldiers would begin to relax, and then the mortars would fall again. The base commander made a request through the chain of command for SAS support. The request went up through the American command structure, which coordinated with the Australian command structure. The request eventually reached the Australian SAS squadron operating in Phuoc Tuy province. The Americans didn't fully understand what they were requesting. They thought the SAS would conduct more aggressive patrols with their equipment. They didn't understand the SAS doctrine. The SAS sent a 4-man reconnaissance. The team consisted of experienced soldiers with multiple tours in Southeast Asia. They had training in reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. They had training in living in the jungle with minimal supplies. They understood the SAS doctrine in their bones. The team moved into the jungle to the north of the American base, moving at night, moving silently. They were looking for the mortar team, but they weren't looking by moving around. They were looking by establishing a position and observing. The mortar team had to establish a firing position somewhere. The firing position had to allow line of sight to the American base. There were only so many places where a firing position could be established. The SAS team established a harbor position in a swamp approximately 2 kilometers of fire support. The terrain was exactly what the SAS. Black water thick with decaying vegetation. Mud so deep that movement was nearly impossible. Thorns and spines on every plant. For 3 days and nights, they remained absolutely still. They ate ration packs eaten cold. They didn't sleep in shifts because they couldn't afford the movement that shifting positions would create. They took turns between active observation and near sleep, the kind of partial rest that animals practice when they're vulnerable to predation. The mud was deeper here than anywhere they had been before. Leeches covered their bodies, clustering in patches. One member of the team had a previous injury that was aggravated by the conditions. His knee was unstable. The swamp conditions put pressure on him. He was in constant low-level pain. He had to endure this pain silently for 72 hours. On the 4th day, at first light, around 6 in the morning, they observed enemy sappers moving into position. There were 8 of them, carrying 2 mortars and ammunition. They moved with the confidence of men who had done this many times before. They established the exact same firing position they had used many times before. The SAS team called in helicopter gunships. The helicopters arrived within minutes. The pilots had coordinates for the mortar position. They had authorization to fire. The first pass was devastating. Machine gun fire stitched across the enemy position. The sappers scattered, but there was nowhere to scatter to. The machine gun fire cut them down. Some were killed immediately. Others were wounded and dying. The helicopters made a second pass. More machine gun fire. The mortars were destroyed. The ammunition was scattered. Some sappers were trying to retreat, trying to move back toward the jungle where they might find cover. But there wasn't enough time. The helicopters made a third pass. The mortar attacks on Fire Support Base Ricks stopped. An American fire support base with 100 men and all its supplies and firepower hadn't solved the problem. 4 SAS soldiers in the mud had solved it in 3 days. This wasn't luck. This wasn't coincidence. This was the manifestation of a philosophy that had been honed over decades in other theaters and now applied with precision in Vietnam. The philosophy was simple. Comfort is a liability. Suffering is a tool. The enemy assumes you will follow the path of least resistance. Therefore, you follow the path of most resistance. The success of this operation spread through the American military establishment in Vietnam. Other base commanders began requesting SAS support. Some American units began experimenting with similar tactics, but the institutional resistance was strong. The American military had built its entire doctrine around forward bases and supply chains. Changing that would require admitting that everything they had built was tactically compromised. The SAS had no such institutional weight. They were small enough to experiment. They were independent enough to fail. And they were ruthless enough to understand that every comfort they removed increased their effectiveness. As the war continued through 1967 and 1968, SAS patrols accumulated an extraordinary record. Kill ratios that seemed impossible. Patrols of 4 men engaging enemy forces of 40 or 50 and emerging with minimal or zero casualty. Intelligence gathering operations that provided actionable information that proved decisive in larger engagement. The SAS was becoming the secret weapon that even the Americans didn't fully understand how to employ. Part of this success was tactical. The SAS had some of the finest soldiers in the world. Their marksmanship was exceptional. Their ability to move through terrain silently was exceptional. But tactical excellence wasn't unique to the SAS. What was unique was psychological. The SAS had accepted that the war couldn't be won by conventional means. The Americans still believed that it could. The SAS believed that the only way to win was to operate by rules that the enemy didn't expect and couldn't counter. When soldiers from other nations studied the SAS operations in Vietnam, they saw tactics and techniques. But the real lesson wasn't tactical, it was psychological. The lesson was that an enemy who will endure what you won't endure will always have the advantage. The SAS understood this in their bones. They taught themselves to want what they endured. They taught themselves to see leeches and mud as allies. The American fire support bases were built on the assumption that soldiers need comfort to maintain effectiveness. The SAS harbor positions were built on the assumption that soldiers who sacrifice comfort gain psychological superiority. History demonstrated which assumption was correct. In the years that followed Vietnam, the SAS continued to operate from this principle. Small teams, minimal supplies, extreme discomfort, maximum effect. They became the template that other special operations forces around the world would begin to study and replicate. American Delta Force studied SS operations. British military units studied SS operations. Military academies began teaching the psychological principles that the SAS had discovered through experience. The lessons were applied in other theaters. In Northern Ireland, SAS units established covert positions in the worst possible terrain, enduring cold and rain and isolation. In the Falkland Islands, SAS teams operated in conditions of extreme cold and discomfort. In the Middle East, SAS operations in desert terrain applied the same principle: sacrifice comfort or invisibility. But the core insight remained unchanged. The man who is willing to suffer more will always defeat the man who is trying to avoid suffering. In Vietnam, this principle was written in mud and blood and the small circles left by leeches on pale skin. It became part of military doctrine. It shaped how special operations forces were trained and deployed for decades. It continues to influence military training today. One SAS veteran, when interviewed years after the war, described the experience of spending days in a harbor position covered with leeches. He said, "You reach a point where you stop thinking of it as suffering. You think of it as work. It's a job that has to be done. The leeches are just part of the job. After a while, you almost welcome them because they mean you're in a place where the enemy won't look." If you ask a SAS veteran about those harbor positions in Vietnam, they don't talk about the discomfort as something that was endured and overcome. They talk about it as something that was necessary and effective. They talk about the leeches as evidence that they were in the right place at the right time. They talk about the mud as a companion that protected them. They talk about the suffering as something that was transformed into strength. The Australian Special Air Service in Vietnam wrote a chapter in military history that is often overlooked. They didn't win the war. Their small numbers meant they couldn't win the war, but they proved that a different way of thinking about warfare was possible. They proved that suffering, properly understood and properly applied, could be more powerful than comfort. They proved that the man in the mud with the leeches could be more deadly than a soldier in a fortified base surrounded by firepower. The doctrine established in Vietnam remains active today. Special operations forces around the world still establish covert positions in inhospitable terrain. They still practice the discipline of remaining motionless for extended periods. They still accept discomfort and hardship as part of their operational methodology. They do these things because the SAS proved that these tactics work. The leeches weren't just parasites, they were teachers. They taught the SAS that the path to effectiveness wasn't comfort, but sacrifice. They taught the SAS that the path to victory wasn't holding territory, but being invisible. They taught the SS that the path to dominance wasn't firepower, but psychology. These lessons, learned in the mud of Vietnam, have shaped military doctrine for more than 50 years and continue to influence how we understand warfare today. If you're interested in military history, tactical innovation, and the psychology of warfare, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We explore the stories that shaped military strategy and changed how we understand conflict. We believe that understanding history is the key to understanding the present. And if this video changed how you think about warfare, leave a comment below. We read every single one. Tell us what you think about the SAS doctrine. Tell us if you think comfort is a liability in warfare. Join the conversation. We want to hear from you. Subscribe now and be part of our community of people who care about military. Thank you for watching.